I'm looking now at what I want to call spoken mediation, by which I mean exactly what you can see here. There is somebody talking to somebody, and there's a mediator there. Because they are speaking different languages, there's somebody who is helping them bridge across the language divide. And they're doing it by speaking. That's what I mean by spoken mediation. There are lots of different names for this thing, though. Firstly, it can be called interpreting. Interpreting just means spoken translation. In the United States, they prefer interpretation. I really prefer interpreting, which is slightly less ambiguous. You could call it medical interpreting if it's in healthcare, court interpreting if it's in the courts, and those terms are kicking around. Put the two together and put it with all the social services that are provided. You could call it public service interpreting and translation, PSIT, and this is a term that's developed more in the United Kingdom and thereafter in Europe to cover the fact that medical and court have a lot in common with work for police services, for home support services, for support for women, etc. There's a whole lot of public services involved, and the people who do it are often doing written as well as spoken work. So that would explain public service interpreting and translation. It is also called community interpreting, which again is a term to put all of this together. Some call it dialogue interpreting because, as you can see, it's mediation in a dialogue, as opposed to conferences, which are not dialogues, it's just one person speaking. Liaison interpreting captures the same thought, the same geometry, if you like. In, I think, the 50s, somewhere around there, it was called escort interpreting, but that now sounds rather like you're offering more than just language services, and I think that one is to be avoided. I want to call it spoken mediation, even though there are all these great terms around. Why? Because I want to connect it with language teaching, and the term mediation already exists in the framework for languages in Europe. Okay, mediation being the use of translation, interpreting, explanation, all kinds of secondary help activities. We can see this here in an engram, which just gets the use of the terms in books over that period from 1990 to 2010. You'll see that community interpreting has been the main term, closely followed by liaison interpreting, which was big in the 90s and has declined. And liaison interpreting is the one you'll actually find in some of the literature on language teaching. Dialogue interpreting is actually the one I prefer because it elegantly explains why it's different from conference interpreting. Okay, and the other ones down there, public service interpreting, have been rather less. PSIT has not really got on the board there. Okay, so there's all sorts of usages around. They are all talking about the same thing, I think, but attacking it from different angles. The important thing is that all that kind of interpreting is opposed to conference interpreting, which is not dialogic. It's one person speaking and you're rendering that one person to an audience. We'll see that next week. Now, that sort of, I'll call it spoken mediation, is the most pressing translation need in Australia. And that's one reason why we're going to look at it now. And it can be of use in additional language teaching, and that's a second reason why we're looking at it now. And in the next few minutes, I want to put those two reasons together to explain why this is an important thing to be considering and teaching in many different ways. Now, in 1975, here you have to understand what Australia is and where it has come from. there was a report on poverty. That's right, poor people in Australia. And in that report, here reported by Jim Clavach, all the submissions relating to migrants mention the problems and poverty that language difficulties caused. That what was the cause of poverty in Australia, one of the main causes were recent immigrants not understanding the language and not getting adequate language services. And so the report contains horror stories of mental patients who were left free because nobody understood what was going on with them, and they're wandering around the streets. People who have the right to social aid, to money to help them get by, and just don't know how to apply for it. Anyway, Australia was in the vanguard of providing services to meet that need. And actually, before the report, 1973 is when free telephone interpreting started in Australia, and it was originally in 8 languages. And this, as far as I know, was the first in the world. I mean, Australia really was the leader there. And then after the report, in 1977, you get the establishment of the National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters, obviously to meet the need of providing interpreters and accrediting interpreters and giving them ethical training, ensuring that they can do the job. So that's why, if you look at that background, that's why spoken mediation is of special importance in Australian society. It's of even more importance when you look at the national policy on languages in Australia. From 1987, we celebrated 50 years of this policy a while ago, written by Joe Lobianco, who is in the University of Melbourne School of Education. And this was the first multilingual national policy in an English-speaking country, because the purpose of the policy was firstly to establish English as the common language and the language of governance, but then to maintain the plurality of other languages and to ensure that they are maintained. So for Joe Lobianco, in this policy, interpreting and translating ought to be regarded as an aspect of service provision rather than a welfarist program for the disadvantaged. That is, we're going to provide these services not because you are poor and you can't speak English. It's because we have an ethical and political duty to supply services to everybody in the country. And in order to do this, we need interpreters. Okay? So a multilingual society needs to guarantee that language does not become a barrier, but the main thing is access to information and services. That's what spoken interpreting, spoken mediation, is doing in Australia. Now, you've got to bear in mind that Melbourne has more than 250 languages being spoken in homes. It's an incredibly multilingual space, and that interpreters are needed in many of those 250 languages for all kinds of public services, as you can see there. We, these days, have free telephone and video interpreting in more than 160 languages, not just for anybody who phones up and wants it, but for the government agencies and people like real estate agents, for example. Anybody dealing with people who don't understand English can, in some institutional way, can get this interpreting for free. It's part of our national policy. Now, over that time, in 50 years, 2019, 52 years, NAATI says it has accredited 10,647 practitioners. These are translators and or interpreters. This is a huge, huge number. By my calculation, the Australian market, judged in economic terms, certainly needs fewer than 4,000 practitioners. So NAATI has been doing its job too well perhaps, And a lot of the accreditations that go out serve the purpose of getting visas, as some of you will be aware. Okay, so there's a mismatch between the work of NAATI and the actual social needs out there that I merely signal as we go past. Now, a corner piece of this effort over 50 years has been training in ethics. Why? Well, with so many languages, you're going to get in people who come in and they know the languages. They'll know English and they know the other language that we find it hard to control. And what they really need training in is first some terminology of the court, if they're working in courts, or of the medical institution and certain ailments. Okay, they'll need that. But then they need training in ethics. And the ethics of the profession go against many of the things that they spontaneously want to do. For example, here we have the Code of Ethics. So it's a summarized version. Some of you have seen this before. The first thing is do not be biased. But if it's a kid in there with their mum, the kid is going to be biased. They're there to help the mum. Or if you're there with your brother or somebody in your particular religious community, you are naturally biased towards helping them. And so the ethics was there to say, well, you know what? This is a profession. It's a part of government service provision. You must not be biased, neither for the government service providers nor for our clients. Same thing, keep secrets. Competence is important. Know your limitations. It also means don't do more than interpret. And then you can see bias is very important. It's repeated there. You have to be impartial, be faithful to the text, which is saying the same thing. And here, only translate and interpret. They want to make sure that when you're doing this work, you don't come in with helpful explanations, or you summarize, or you add your expert knowledge as well. They want to make sure that the person there is helping the service be provided and not intervening on their own behalf, or even on behalf of the person seeking the service. Okay, maintaining professional relationships, keep learning, professional solidarity. These are fairly standard things in the codes of ethics. I just point out this is the key bit here. This is presented as a code of ethics for all translation and interpreting in Australia. However, in many other situations that are not public service provision, we could imagine them not to obtain. For example, if it's a business negotiation and you are hired by one side in order to support their cause, you will be biased. And you may not be faithful to the text. You can add things in for your expertise, and you might want to do a little more than translate in and interpret. You might want to give advice on cross-cultural strategies and things like that. So the ethics is written for spoken mediation in a very restricted professional sense, whereas there are many, many, many other situations where one could imagine those rules being broken. Okay, so that's just to indicate. For example, in political meetings, there is not one mediator. Here you've got, let me see, that's Gorbachev and his interpreter, Reagan and his interpreter, and the interpreters are checking on each other because it's not assumed that they are unbiased. In literary translation, people add notes and prefaces and glossaries and explanations to help people understand the text. And mediation, I remember working in Spain with people in the hospitals for Arabic, and they were very clear. They said, we are not interpreters, we are mediators. Why did they say that? Because they're there to explain, particularly to Arabic-speaking women in the Western hospital, how that's working, and to explain to the medical staff the particular needs and concerns of the Islamic women. Okay, so their role was really cultural mediation over and above the actual language work that they did, and they wanted to call themselves mediators. So there's another way of looking at this problem, and my use of the term mediation is in recognition of that wider scope of duties, of things that can and often should be done. It's rather easy to find lots of training videos like this because the people who come in have the languages, and what they need are the ethics. They know where to sit, they know what to do. We've got these training videos that show you how to do it and how not to do it. I'll just see what they've got here. Let's see.
So can you ask your brother how he's doing today?
Yeah, he's fine.
Does he?
Okay.
So can you ask your brother how he's doing today?
Yeah, he's fine.
Okay, number one, you don't answer for him. He didn't relay it. So he's established a dialogue between these two people without the third person. Okay, and then...
Does he have any problems at all? Like, why is he here today? It's like maybe he has a little gas or something.
Yeah, it's some little gas.
Maybe a little gas.
Okay. This sort of thing happens remarkably, with remarkable frequency. What's happening here, in the second utterance, he did convey it, but he didn't want to convey back the full answer. Perhaps he knew that the bellyache was the most important thing, but very often in some cultures, there's something called a gratuitous acquiescence. If the person with authority in power says something, it's felt good to agree with what they say, regardless of whether it actually represents the problem. And here we left out the headaches and things, which could create difficulties for the diagnosis down the track. So that's an example of how not to do it. And a lot of the training that happens is on that level. They'll show what happens, they'll show what happens, what goes wrong as a result of that. And then later in this same video, you can see it on canvas, they show you how it should happen, how the actual dialogic situation should happen. It's interesting when you look at the negatives here, that he says, we'll just play it at the beginning.
So can you ask your brother how he's doing today?
Yeah. Can you ask your brother? So he's forcing him to adopt reported speech, whereas in theory it should be him speaking directly to the patient and the interpreter adopts the I of the speaker. Okay? So the first person, that doesn't belong to the interpreter. But here it's operating in terms of reported speech, which is not how it should work. In theory, the reporter should not be, the mediator here should not have a first person in the tripartite dialogue. Okay, we'll come to that a bit later. Well, we've got it here actually. We had ask him this, he says Y. Ask him X, he says Y. But it should really be, how are you? I'm fine. And the interpreter relays that verbatim. Okay? That's the theory. Actually, a lot of this does happen, even at quite high levels. It's not supposed to. It's supposed to be like this, but the ethics and the norms somehow don't get through to the entire profession. Now, that's all I have to say about the social need for spoken mediation, okay? It's a huge need in Australia. It's reasonably well paid in Australia with respect to other countries, but it's not as well paid as conference interpreting, for example, and often it's something that people will not go and get a specialized master's for. That is, if you're investing your savings in a master's degree, you would want to go out and use your language skills at a higher level, probably, than the spoken mediation. Or often this spoken mediation is mixed with written translation and other things that you can do with languages. Now, let's consider additional language learning, okay? Now, let's just stay in Australia. Why would people want to learn languages? Okay, well, the big thing is the teaching of official languages. So here, if you come in as an immigrant, you get and you got the visas and everything, you get, I think, 500 hours of free English classes. You're going to learn English. That's the official or de facto official language. You're going to learn it. But the policy is for the maintenance of languages other than English, and the ideal is to see them being maintained in families and in communities across 2 generations. Okay, it's quite normal for an immigrant family to come in and speak, for example, Chinese in the home, and the kids will speak Chinese at the home and English at school, and then they go and get married to somebody who doesn't speak Chinese, and when they set up a family in the 3rd generations, are they going to speak Chinese at home and English, or just English, or both? And that's where the crunch comes. So we get, these days around Melbourne, lots of people who would like to learn a language, especially Italian, Greek, Spanish, or Russian, in order to speak with their grandparents, because they have passive knowledge. They used to use it at home. They'd hear their parents using the language, but they were never taught the language, and they would like to recuperate it as part of their identity. And this is where language learning comes into this idea of a multilingual city. Okay? You've got the mediation being supplied so that the city, the polis, can work, supplying common services without language being a barrier. But the other part of this is education, which should also help that. Not just by giving people language knowledge, but also fostering pride in non-official languages. So you don't have to hide the other language. The people who are working as the interpreters there can feel proud of knowing a language other than English and being able to help people in that. And getting people to learn something of the other languages that are around them. I'll just mention here the 50 Words Project. There's a link in Canvas. You can go in there and you can learn 50 words in many Aboriginal languages from around Australia. Does that help the language survive? Not really, but that makes you aware, I think, that there is another linguistic reality in Australia, and a very rich and diverse reality. So language learning is also part of the deal. Translation and interpreting on the one hand to provide services, but language learning to make sure that the multicultural society stays multilingual. There are ways of doing this. I just put this here. This is actually from a textbook to teach German. Yeah, Deutsch ist easy. And they're telling you already, they got some English in there. This is for immigrants into Germany to learn German, which they have to do, like people come here to learn English. But what's interesting is, this is a lesson on modal verbs. And we've got English modal verbs, then we see how it's done in German. So they're recognizing that people are coming in and they're going to use English as a bridge. So translation here is part of what's going on. And then you're invited to put in here and say how it's done in your mother tongue, in your L1. So the actual class will have a discussion of modal verbs, not just in German, which is the language to be learned here, but also in English, which is the bridge language, and we can discuss any other language that's available in the group, so the people can show that they have this other language, explain how it works, and use it in the comparison with the languages that are being learned. That looks like a written exercise, but it can be a spoken activity as well when people compare how modal verbs are working in the different languages. I've been working on this problem. There's lots of resistance to translation and interpreting in the additional language class, but we've been doing experiments to see what can happen with it. And this was one doctoral thesis done in Turkey by Bina Attar, and she set up control groups, and one group did translation activities and the other group did straight immersion activities. And she found actually that the translation activities produced higher writing scores. So translation helped in the writing, often because it incorporates a lot of comparative grammar, but it was about the same for the speaking. Okay, that translation as it's conceived as written translation and comparative grammar is not really helping people gain fluency in the language to be learnt. Okay, she did find that the students were more in favor of using translation than the teachers, but the missing thing here seemed to be the oral component. And that's why I'm especially interested in looking at the way spoken mediation works in society and asking if that can be used in the classroom, since the classroom in some societies is aimed to achieve the same purpose. Nuna Ayvazyan, Translation in Foreign Language. This is another doctoral thesis. Here, it was found that the classes with translation activities actually increased in-class interaction. And we know that the more interaction there is, that is students volunteering, saying things in class without being asked, the more interaction there is, the more motivation there usually is, and the more motivation, the better language learning works. So this was actually an interesting finding because the interaction here was spoken. And in fact, it concerned points of grammar where everybody felt that they could say something about their language and they could have arguments about what was correct or not in the various languages. And so there was more discussion, more interaction in the classroom because of these spoken mediation activities that were there, okay? And it was therefore a more inclusive class than it was without the translation, when it was just all conducted, in this case, in English. So there's some hope there. Now, what I want to do, putting these two strands together, I want to take what's happening out there in spoken mediation in society and see if it can be used in the additional language learning class, that is English learning class or whatever. And I find the old literature, actually there's quite a few, going back to this, 1985, he's calling it liaison interpreting, but it's the same thing as what I've got here. And what I've done is I've gone back and I've got some ideas from there, and there's a Word document that I've made available to you with lots of language learning ideas where they're talking about translation. And I've tried to work in an activity for interpreting, okay? So I'll just go through it with you because this is what you're going to have to do for the tutorial. Here's the learning outcome. Understand and apply question structures. So we're interested in interrogatives in the two languages. In this case, it was Spanish-English, and it was online because it can be done online. You've got your breakout rooms, etc. The whole class watches a 3-minute training video on Spanish-English medical interpreting because we've got lots of them there, okay? And I've put the example there is for you, like the one we just saw a minute ago. It has to concern something non-serious, okay? You can't have people dying of cancer. It's not going to help the class. It can be a bellyache or something like that, all right? But something not otherwise it gets morbid, okay? Students look at that and they take notes on the way questions are asked in Spanish and English. And here the example they would be looking at is not the reported speech one, it would be the direct speech one. Okay, instead of saying, ask him how he feels, the doctor should say, how do you feel? Okay, and then the students will note down how that's done in Spanish. And then working in the groups, because it's only 3 people per group, they take the roles of doctor, patient, and interpreter to act out the dialogue, and then they rotate the roles around. So they're going to do that 3 times. So everybody plays each role. And they can change what's wrong, but they can change what they're, as long as it's not too serious and they have some fun with it, okay? And you're allowing 40 minutes for that. I mean, in theory, it should only take, it's a 5-minute video, it should only take 15, but it always takes more than double what you think it should. And then at the end of the class, I'm proposing everybody comes back together, we watch the video again, but instead of hearing the interpreter, we stop it there, and individual students have to give their version of what the interpreter is going to say. And then we compare that with what the interpreter actually said. Simple class, it's a simple kind of learning outcome, but we've used the techniques of spoken mediation in the classroom to learn something about language, and as they do it, they've also learned something about professional spoken mediation. Why? Well, many of these learners may be called upon to use these skills in their particular communities.